Good evening. I'm Judy Woodruff. On the NewsHour tonight, the U.S. House Judiciary Committee votes to hold Attorney General William Barr in contempt of Congress, a move the Democratic chairman says amounts to a constitutional crisis, as President Trump asserts executive privilege over the Mueller report. Then escalating tensions with Iran. A year after the U.S. pulls out of the nuclear deal, Tehran signals it too will stop complying with parts of the landmark agreement. Plus, inside a mega fire, Miles O'Brien on the race to protect California from devastating wildfires.
You really almost need to know every tree, every bush, every piece of grass and what its state is to really predict what's going to happen.
All that and more on tonight's PBS NewsHour.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by
Babbel, a language program that teaches real-life conversations in a new language, such as Spanish, French, German, Italian, and more. Babbel's 10 to 15-minute lessons are available as an app or online. More information on Babbel.com.
Consumer Cellular, BNSF Railway, Financial Services Firm, Raymond James.
Supporting social entrepreneurs and their solutions to the world's most pressing problems. SkollFoundation.org.
The Lemelson Foundation, committed to improving lives through invention in the U.S. and developing countries. On the web at lemelson.org. Supported by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, committed to building a more just, verdant, and peaceful world. More information at macfound.org. And with the ongoing support of these institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
There's an escalating showdown between the two ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, and both sides are digging in their heels. The chairman of the U.S. House Judiciary Committee says it has today taken a grave and momentous step. Lisa Desjardins begins our coverage of the mounting clash over access to the entire Mueller report.
Today, power moves in an escalating fight between branches.
Judiciary Committee will please come to order.
House Democrats called a rare hearing, the first step toward holding the Attorney General in contempt of Congress. Judiciary Chairman Jerry Nadler pointed to refusals to testify or to hand over an unredacted Mueller report.
The Trump administration has taken obstruction of Congress to new heights.
Simultaneously, the Trump administration made its own statement. The Department of Justice sent Nadler a letter saying the contempt vote was unnecessary and that the president is exerting protective executive privilege over the documents Democrats want, meaning the agency will not turn them over. That raised already heated temperatures at the Capitol.
I can only conclude that the president now seeks to take a wrecking ball through the Constitution of the United States of America. For the first time in the history of the United States, a president is now exerting executive privilege over every aspect of life.
Unfortunately, we have an administration that is choosing to have a temper tantrum that is designed to accomplish one thing. And that one thing is to never let the real facts of the Mueller report come to light.
Republicans charged that Democrats are playing politics.
What a cynical, mean-spirited, counterproductive, irresponsible step it is.
Our Democrat colleagues have weaponized our critical oversight responsibilities.
Mr. Chairman.
Republican Jim Sensenbrenner said the Attorney General cannot hand over all of the Mueller report because grand jury testimony in particular must stay secret.
I think it is absolutely shocking that the majority of this committee is going to ask the chief law enforcement officer of the United States to commit a crime. Shocking.
Democrats rejected that argument as hyperbole.
Nobody's asking the Attorney General to disobey the law. We're asking the Attorney General to obey the law and produce the Mueller report and the supporting documentation.
At the White House, hard pushback at the committee and Chairman Nadler.
The Attorney General is protecting information, grand jury information, confidential information that he cannot release. The fact that the chairman knows that and continues to ignore it is absolutely absurd.
Charging contempt of Congress is a power lawmakers have held since the 1700s, but it is rarely used against members of the executive branch, and even more rarely against the Attorney General. There was a sense of the stakes on both sides.
I think people should recognize that this is a deadly, serious moment. The rule of law and our basic institutions that have made our democracy the envy of the world are being tested.
Our Democratic colleagues seem to be on a mission. They're determined to destroy Attorney General Barr, or at least discredit him in the eyes of the American people.
The vote reflected the sentiments.
Those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no.
No.
A party line split, with Democrats voting to charge the Attorney General with contempt. That resolution now moves to the full House.
This evening, it is being widely reported that the Republican-led Senate Intelligence Committee has subpoenaed Donald Trump Jr. They intend to ask, reportedly, about his meeting with a Russian lawyer at Trump Tower in New York in 2016 and efforts by the Trump Organization to build a Trump high-rise in Moscow. And Lisa joins me now, along with our White House correspondent, Yamiche Alcindor. Hello to both of you. So from your perspective, Yamiche, what are these power moves about that the White House is making, and what is their rationale for claiming executive privilege?
Well, this really comes down to historic power plays between the White House and Congress, each using their constitutional powers to really go head to head. So on the White House's side, the president is saying that Democrats are bitter about the 2016 election, and as a result, they're carrying out partisan attacks. Democrats, of course, say they're just going and doing oversight over the president, that he should be held accountable. When it comes to exerting executive privilege, the White House has two rationales for this. The first is that they say the materials that Congress wants are actually illegal to release. They say that there are issues with law enforcement sources, intelligence sources, and also grand jury material. The other thing that White House aides have been telling me today, the White House wanted to exert executive privilege before the hearing because they wanted to protect Attorney General Bill Barr. They say that it's going to be harder for him to be held in contempt if the president is exerting executive privilege. So this is really about the White House trying to have Bill Barr's back.
And Lisa, you're talking to everybody on the Hill. What are they saying? What are Democrats saying this is all about? And why do they reject the president's claim of executive privilege?
That's so interesting about protecting the Attorney General, because Democrats believe that the president already waived executive privilege here by allowing this testimony in the first place to Robert Mueller. They said that's when he should have claimed executive privilege, not now. So they say that that's not an argument that they can put stock in. They also say that this is about more than what's happening. And increasingly, Judy, I feel not just tension, but a larger concern from Democrats. They see a potential erosion of checks and balances. I talked to Representative Debbie Mucarsel-Powell from Florida. She's an immigrant from Ecuador, and she told me that she was thinking about South American dictators and how one small kind of erosion in checks and balances can hurt a democracy.
And so back to you, Yamiche. Where does this go from here, and what is the White House saying about some of the Democrats calling this a constitutional crisis?
Well, the battle between White House and Congress is just getting started. On the issue of contempt, the DOJ put out a very strong statement today saying that that Attorney General Bill Barr should not be bullied into releasing information that he thinks is illegal. Then you're moving on to the idea of executive privilege. There's this idea that there might be pushback between Robert Mueller and Don McGahn, the former White House counsel, to testifying before Congress. The White House is saying that's separate issues and that they haven't made a determination on whether or not they would allow that to go forward. But I was talking to a White House source today. That person said that the White House has already told Don McGahn not to turn over any documents to Congress because of issues of executive privilege. Then, of course, this idea, there's a broadening it out Don Jr. being subpoenaed by the Republican-led Senate Intelligence Committee really goes to the heart of this idea that Congress might now start having fights between the president's own party and his son. And then lastly, this idea of constitutional crisis. I put the question directly to Sarah Sanders today and said, what do you make of the fact that there are people saying that the president's edging the country closer and closer to a constitutional crisis? She said Democrats are the ones overstepping and that the president is on firm legal grounds here. So she's backing up the president as Democrats are, of course, sounding the alarm.
It's two totally different, completely opposite sets of argument. Right. So, Lisa, we see the Congress moving closer to a full House vote on this question of contempt. Historically, does that mean the House is likely to get what it wants?
It's complicated, Judy. What ends up happening in these cases, as I reported, executive branch contempt of Congress is very rare. We've seen a couple of cases in recent years, one, White House counsel Harriet Miers under George W. Bush, and then Attorney General Eric Holder under President Obama. In both of those cases, Judy, it went to courts. The courts took a long time to decide, and it went through appeal after appeal. In the end, while the courts upheld the idea, the concept of Congress having this power, the courts did not want to enforce it. And the presidents at the time were able to basically run out the clock. Those documents were obtained by Congress in both cases, but generally not until a new president was elected. So running out the clock is very possible here for President Trump. However, there's something exceedingly rare that some Democrats are talking about. They have a different power of contempt that they're not invoking now. It's called an inherent contempt of Congress, which means Congress itself can assess fines and long ago used to actually imprison people itself. Some Democrats are saying perhaps it's time for them to try and use that power, which has not been used since 1935.
I was going to say that has not been used for a very long time.
There used to be a House jail, of course, no longer.
All right. Well, it seems to me it couldn't get much more serious than it is now, but you're watching.
That's right.
You and Yamiche, thank you both. Yamiche Alcindor, Lisa Desjardins, we thank you. In the day's other news, Iran's president declared that his country will step up enrichment of uranium if the 2015 nuclear deal is not renegotiated. He warned of action in 60 days unless European nations help mitigate U.S. sanctions. The U.S. answered with new sanctions on Iran's metals industry. And in London, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo called for unity against Tehran.
They've made a number of statements about actions they threatened to do in order to get the world to jump. We'll see what they actually do. The United States will wait to observe that. And I am confident that as we watch Iran's activity, that the United Kingdom and our European partners will move forward together to ensure that Iran has no pathway for a nuclear weapons system.
The U.S. withdrew from the nuclear deal 1 year ago. Today, Russia blamed Washington's actions for Iran's decision. But Israel warned again that it will not let Iran obtain nuclear weapons. We'll delve into all of this right after the news summary. This was Election Day in South Africa, and the ruling African National Congress faced strong challenges after 25 years in power. Voters lined up with a chance to voice their frustration with corruption scandals and surging unemployment. There were signs that overall turnout was low. In this country, a Colorado teenager appeared in court a day after a school shooting that left 1 student dead and 8 wounded. 18-year-old Devin Erickson kept his head down during the hearing. He was arrested Tuesday along with a girl who is a juvenile. There was no word on the motive for the shooting. The U.S. Border Patrol reported today that more than 100,000 migrants were caught at the southern border in April. That is for the second month in a row. Meanwhile, a federal appeals court agreed on Tuesday to making those seeking legal asylum wait in Mexico for immigration hearings. The Ninth Circuit Court in San Francisco let the policy stand pending a legal challenge. Drivers from rideshare companies Uber and Lyft protested their pay in 10 major U.S. cities today. They turned off their smartphone apps, cutting their connections to would-be customers. Drivers argue that they are getting poverty wages, but the companies they work for are earning billions in profits.
All drivers, everywhere in a country deserve a fair pay and fair treatment. So we are hoping that this will make a big impact and make our base companies listen to us.
The strike comes 2 days before Uber's initial public stock offering. The company says it expects to be valued at $91 billion. In Oregon, thousands of teachers staged a walkout today to lobby state lawmakers. They demanded more funding for schools and protested large class sizes and low graduation rates. It is the latest in a wave of teacher strikes that began in West Virginia last year. TV ads for prescription drugs will have to start showing list prices of the medications. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services announced the rule today. It affects drugs that cost more than $35 for a month's supply. Walmart is raising its minimum age to buy tobacco products and e-cigarettes to 21 from 18. The world's largest retailer says that the policy takes effect in July at all of its 5,300 U.S. stores. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration had put Walmart and others on notice for selling tobacco to minors. On Wall Street, a late sell-off wiped out a rally as investors waited for trade talks with China to resume tomorrow. The Dow Jones Industrial Average gained just 2 points to close at 25,967. The Nasdaq fell 20 points, and the S&P 500 slipped 4. And Britain's new royal baby now has a name. He is Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor. The parents say Prince Harry, of course, and his American wife, Meghan Markle, announced it today, and they showed off their newborn baby for the first time. The baby is 7th in line to the British throne. Still to come on the NewsHour, the president of Iran says his nation may soon restart banned nuclear activity. New tax information reveals the scope of President Trump's business losses, and much more. Today, Iran announced it plans to stop complying with portions of the nuclear deal it signed with Western powers in 2015. Iran stopped short of withdrawing from the deal altogether. But as Nick Schifrin reports, the announcement increases already escalating tensions with the United States.
The Iran deal made a fundamental trade. Iran restricted its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. 1 year ago today, the Trump administration withdrew from the deal and has since reimposed sanctions. For the last year, Iran complied with the deal. But today, Iran said it would not abide by all the deal's restrictions. Number one, the deal limits Iran's stockpiles of low-enriched uranium, which is nuclear fuel, and heavy water, which is used to operate a nuclear reactor. Today, Iran said it would no longer adhere to those limits. And if Iran does exceed the caps, it will no longer be in compliance with the deal. And then Iran threatened even more dramatic actions. To produce a bomb, you typically need to enrich uranium at 90%. Before the deal, Iran enriched uranium at nearly 20%, which the U.S. said meant Iran could break out and create a bomb within a few months. After the deal, Iran enriched uranium at 3.67% and removed most of its centrifuges, moving breakout time to more than a year. Today, Iran said if it doesn't receive economic benefits allowed by the deal in the next 60 days, it would not adhere to, quote, any uranium enrichment limit. And it would also take a plan to convert the Arak nuclear reactor so it doesn't produce large amounts of plutonium and cancel it. Despite those threats, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani said today Iran was still in the deal.
Our nation should know that we have not withdrawn from the nuclear deal. They should not think that the nuclear deal does not exist anymore. Today we announced a reduction, not withdrawal.
And for more on this, we turn to Iran's ambassador to the United Nations, Majid Takht Rabanchi. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining the NewsHour today. You've gone a whole year since the Trump administration pulled out of the Iran deal without responding in a major way. Why respond today?
Over the last year, we exercised extreme patience in order to show that Iran is ready. Iran is ready to take extra mile in order to show that it is sincere in its implementation of the nuclear deal. But unfortunately, due to U.S. bullying of even its closest allies, we have not received the economic benefit that we were promised to receive based on the nuclear deal. And then we were left with no other option than to say that for 60 days, we are going to stop implementing or to cease performance of some of our obligations, voluntary obligations based on the nuclear deal. And we will see what will happen during the next 60 days. The window of diplomacy is not closed. We believe that Iran will speak, will negotiate with the partners, the remaining participants of the JCPOA, and we will see what will be the outcome of the negotiations.
Ambassador, you say that you were left with no other option, but why do you need to enrich uranium at a higher level than 3.67%? What's your intentions by doing that, or possibly doing that?
Well, no, for the time being, we are adhering to the JCPOA on the limit of the enrichment, the level of enrichment. What we have said is that for the next 60 days, we are going just to be free for our stockpile. We are not talking about enriching more than 3.67% for the next 60 days.
Right, but President Rouhani did say today that you would enrich higher than 3.67 if you don't get those economic incentives, which haven't come so far.
Of course we will. Of course we will. The reason is that our partners have had more than enough time for the last year and a half or so to compensate what the Americans have done to the JCPOA. So if they cannot do it in the next 2 months, that means that the political will is not there, and then we will act in accordance with our national interest.
Today, President Trump said that he still hoped to meet with Iran's leadership. Does Iran have any interest in meeting with President Trump?
There is no utility in meeting somebody who carelessly tear apart, an international agreement. It was not an agreement between Iran and the United States. Other countries, the European Union, were part of it. So all of a sudden, we see that the president comes and say, "I don't like it because of so many reasons." Because the former president took the initiative to sign such an agreement with Iran. So how can we trust somebody who carelessly and recklessly do something like this?
Ambassador, quickly in the time we have left, there are some people who I'm talking to here who are experts on Iran fear that the speech by President Rouhani today will allow hardliners here in the U.S. and perhaps Israel a stronger case to argue that Iran is not trustworthy. What's your response to that?
I think the hardliners, as our foreign minister has coined it, 4 Bs, Bibi Netanyahu, Bolton, Ben Zayed, and Ben Salman, they are doing whatever they can, no matter what Iran does. So it doesn't matter how we are dealing with JCPOA. Their agenda is to provoke. Their agenda is to agitate the situation. Their agenda is to prepare a war against Iran. We are not trying to wage war against anybody, but definitely we will defend ourselves no matter what.
Ambassador Majid Rabanchi, Ambassador of Iran to the United Nations, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, sir.
And now with me for the Trump administration's view is Brian Hook, the State Department Special Representative for Iran. Brian Hook, thank you for coming back to the NewsHour. You just heard Ambassador Rabanchi accuse the U.S. of saying that your real intention is to provoke Iran and to, quote, prepare for war. Is that the U.S. intention?
I didn't really hear what he said. I can just say that today what we saw with the Iranian regime is another example of nuclear blackmail. This is a strategy that they've used very effectively for many years. They do it to intimidate other nations so that they then give Iran the economic benefits that they think they deserve. And in fact, Iran does not need to be enriching any fissile material at a level that is above what is required for a peaceful nuclear program. And so we're very happy to be outside of the Iran nuclear deal. We have a lot more freedom to deter Iran and prevent it from ever acquiring a nuclear weapon.
So you call it nuclear blackmail. Let me go into what President Rouhani said today. He said that Iran would no longer abide by the caps on heavy water and low-enriched uranium. He threatened in 60 days to do more when it came to enrichment, but they are in the deal. And as you heard the ambassador say, diplomacy is still an option. So, in some ways, is their response restrained?
I think, as I said earlier, I think this is the Iranian regime, the world's leading sponsor of terrorism, threatening to enrich levels of uranium beyond what is necessary for a peaceful nuclear program. They have also used the nuclear program as cover to expand their range of activities to run an expansionist revolutionary foreign policy around the Middle East. And it runs all the way from Lebanon to the Houthis in Yemen. And so what we've done outside of the deal is to drive up the costs of Iran's very expansionist foreign policy, and also being outside of the deal with the enormous economic pressure that we're able to put on this regime, we're in a much better position to achieve our national security goals outside of the deal.
I think your critics would point out that it would be easier to confront Iranian malign behavior while restricting their nuclear program.
Well, Iran is still in the Iran nuclear deal. We're outside of it, and so we're not under any of those restrictions any longer. When we were in the deal, we weren't able to use any of our oil and banking sanctions against Iran to change their malign behavior around the Middle East. We've now sanctioned almost 1,000 Iranian individuals and organizations for a range of activities around the nuclear program, the missile program, the regional aggression, and the arbitrary detention of American citizens. We are seeing a difference. Iran has had to cut its defense budget for 2 successive years. Its biggest client in the Middle East, Hezbollah, has been making a public appeal for donations because the money from Iran is running out. So we're very happy with the positive impact that we're having just in the 1 year, and today is the 1-year anniversary of us getting out of the Iran deal.
Brian Hook, we've got about a minute left, so I want to ask you about that maximum pressure campaign. You just talked about almost 1,000 people or entities. Today, you announced new sanctions on Iranian steel, aluminum, and copper. One of the goals that you and I have talked about is getting Iran back to the table to renegotiate what you've called a bigger nuclear deal. Is there any evidence that your maximum pressure campaign is convincing Iran to come back to the table?
Well, we have a goal of getting to a new and better deal to succeed the existing Iran nuclear deal, which is only limited to the nuclear program. We are interested in an agreement that would address the nuclear program, the missile program, regional aggression, human rights abuses, and the like. Secretary Pompeo made that very clear about a year ago. What the kind of demands that we have placed on the Islamic Republic to behave more like a normal nation and less like a revolutionary cause. Putting in place that sort of clarity we think has been very helpful for the international community, and it's highlighted Iran's regional aggression, and we're having more countries come our way over the last year because of our diplomacy.
Brian Hook, Special Representative for Iran at the U.S. State Department. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nick.
We now turn to Ambassador Wendy Sherman. She was the lead U.S. negotiator for the nuclear agreement with Iran during the Obama administration, and she's now a senior fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard. You heard me ask Brian Hook whether the U.S. intention is to provoke Iran, is to wage war, which is what we heard from the Iranian ambassador. Do you believe the U.S. intention is to provoke Iran?
Well, I hope that the U.S. intention is not to provoke Iran to leave the deal or to provoke Iran into a regional conflict. Indeed, I think that President Rouhani very carefully threaded the needle today, not leaving the deal, but beginning to take steps to say, please, let's not escalate this situation. I wish the Trump administration were as measured in its approach. And I would say to Brian Hook and to the Trump administration, what have they gotten as a result of withdrawing from this deal a year ago? There is more malign behavior in the Middle East, not less. Americans are still in prison and missing in Iran. The Iranian people do not have more freedom, and the administration has set Iran back on a path to perhaps working to obtain nuclear weapons, exactly what we stopped from happening.
So you just said the U.S. has led Iran onto that path, but as I asked the ambassador, why should Iran enrich more than 3.67. What's wrong with where they are right now, and why isn't that criticism valid?
Iran is very happy to stay at 3.67% in its enrichment of uranium if, indeed, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran deal, stays in place. And those limitations are for quite some time. And it is all about,
although, as you know, your critics say not
yes,
long enough.
I know they say it's not forever. It is least solid for 15 years, that you cannot go above a certain stockpile limit. You can't go above 3.67%. But even after that, there are limitations on what Iran can do. And there is the most extensive monitoring and inspection of Iran of any country in the world.
Iran said, as you heard the ambassador, that we will enrich beyond 3.67 if we don't get the incentives that the JCPOA, that the Iran deal intended for Iran to get. The Europeans would be the ones to help deliver that. Can they deliver the incentives economically to keep Iran within this deal?
I think it's very tough because, as I think you know quite well, the U.S. secondary economic sanctions, which say that if you deal with the Central Bank of Iran, you can't deal with an American bank, are incredibly powerful because, quite frankly, virtually every company in the world would choose an American bank over the Central Bank of Iran. And when you marry that with the oil sanctions, that with the administration trying to go to zero exports allowed around the world, they're very powerful sanctions. The U.S. has to be careful in what it does, though. If we use these sanctions too much, people will begin to say that we should no longer have the dollar as the reserve currency of the world. The other thing I'd point out, Nick, is, in my view, there are tactics here, but no strategy, and certainly no consistent strategy. If we take a look at North Korea, if we take a look at Venezuela, if we take a look at how we're dealing with the Chinese and the Uyghurs, we see a very different set of standards.
The U.S. earlier this week deployed a carrier group to the Middle East, as well as a bomber squadron, in response to intelligence, according to the officials that I spoke to, in which Iran was planning to target U.S. troops and also target U.S. allies, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Doesn't that show that the Iran deal didn't improve Iranian behavior?
We never said that it would improve Iranian behavior in the region. What we did say is that we needed to get the nuclear weapon off the table so it would not deter our actions and our partners and our allies' actions in the region. And we could then use all of the sanctions that we still had on Iran to press them to the table to deal with their malign behavior, the state sponsorship of terrorism, their human rights abuses, and their keeping Americans in prison and not bringing back missing Americans to our home.
Very quickly, I only have a few seconds left. Iran's strategy seems to be waiting out the Trump administration. If a Democrat is elected in 2020, should he or she rejoin the deal and or try and expand it?
I think every Democratic candidate that I've heard have said that they would immediately rejoin the deal. But like in any arms control negotiation, you usually have a follow-on agreement.
Wendy Sherman, lead U.S. negotiator for the Iran deal. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And for a view from the streets of Iran, we have more online where I talk to special correspondent Reza Sayah in Tehran. That's at pbs.org/newshour.
Congressional Democrats are expected to decide tomorrow whether they will go to court to obtain President Trump's recent tax returns. The president broke with modern tradition by refusing to release his returns. Democrats and other experts have questioned whether there could be information about foreign investors, about debts or other business arrangements in those returns. Today, the New York State Senate approved a bill that would allow the president's state tax records to be turned over to Congress. As William Brangham tells us, this line of inquiry picked up new fuel overnight after a New York Times investigation shed light on the president's past tax records and his large business losses.
Judy, the Times investigations found that the very moment Donald Trump was portraying himself as the most successful deal maker of the 1980s and 90s, his actual balance sheet told a very different story. The Times analysis found Mr. Trump lost more than $1 billion between 1985 and 1994. The report says, quote, "Year after year, Mr. Trump appears to have lost more money than nearly any other individual American taxpayer. Those combined losses, the article contends, enabled him to avoid paying income taxes for 8 years. The president and his legal team have called the Times report inaccurate. I'm joined now by one of the reporters who broke this story, Russ Buettner of the New York Times. Russ, thank you very much for being here. You have painted this really remarkable portrait of this decade in Donald Trump's financial life. Help us understand, why was he losing so much money during this time?
Well, if you look back at the records from that era, he was buying things at extraordinarily high prices and then taking on even more debt to build them out to his design. And then the revenues that he brought in never supported that debt load. So with each acquisition, he would go further into the red ink, and the losses just mounted as the years progressed.
And what were these ventures for people who are not that familiar with his history?
He originally started building apartment buildings. He would make a condominium building that would sell through, and he would keep the retail space. Then he branched out into a variety, a very eclectic collection of things. He bought an offshoot of the NFL. He bought a football team. He bought an airline. He started opening casinos that were extraordinarily expensive. He bought a landmarked New York City hotel. And all of that just mounted up to about $3 billion in debt he took on over just about a 5-year period.
And as your report points out, he did have some successful ventures, but in any given year, it seems the losses from other ventures swamped those returns.
That's exactly right. He's constantly sort of changing focuses. There was a period of time that lasted about 2 years where he would buy with borrowed money large holdings in a public corporation, leak a news that he had bought that, and then he might take the company over, and as soon as the stock went up, he would sell. He made about $60 million over a couple of years doing that. And then the market figured out that he was not going to take over the companies, and it stopped reacting. That sort of ended. But there was like that. There were these ventures that he did make money on, but the losses from his companies, his other enterprises would wash away all his tax liability for even those extraordinary gains.
The president, as you know, has said, first off, that everybody was doing this back in the 80s and 90s, and then he also said that your reporting was inaccurate. Given that you don't actually have a signed copy of President Trump's tax returns, how did you compile this data, and how do you know it is actually accurate?
What we have is a printout from President Trump's tax transcript, which is a printout from an official database that the IRS has kept since the 1960s of every tax return that's filed by every individual every year. There are internal quality controls on that data. It's used for a variety of policy setting reasons. They use it to target audits, and they bring printouts from it to audits. And if you wanted to request yours, you could file that request with the IRS, and they would send it to you as an official record of the return you filed. It's in fact a very reliable record that's been used for very important things for a long time.
Lastly, this is, of course, coming amidst the fight of congressional Democrats trying to get more recent tax returns from the president. What might those returns tell us that we don't now know?
We're guessing into a vacuum a little bit because we just really don't know, but we could certainly tell for the first time maybe if his claims of wealth are really accurate. We'd be able to see how profitable his businesses are. He's reported on his disclosure forms revenue figures, not profitability, and profitability has been a problem for Donald Trump throughout his career. We could tell what the sources of those incomes are. We could tell whether he has any properties that are in jeopardy. We could tell if he's got partners that he hasn't disclosed. We could tell if he's got more debt than what he's allowed and who he's borrowed money from. And we could look for conflicts of interest that might not be apparent now between his public policy and all the countries around the world where he has investments in money-earning properties.
All right. Russ Buettner of the New York Times, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
As the first person to declare his candidacy for the Democratic Party's 2020 presidential nomination, John Delaney has been running for president for almost 2 years. The businessman and former Maryland congressman now faces a crowded field and the challenge of taking on some well-known names. And John Delaney joins me now. Welcome again to the NewsHour.
Thank you for having me, Judy.
So, John Delaney, quickly on our lead story tonight, we're reporting on President Trump exerting executive privilege. He will not turn over to Congress the full Mueller report. Do you think, again, just quickly, this moves the Congress any closer to impeachment proceedings?
Well, I think it moves the Congress closer to having more investigations and trying to subpoena the report and those things, as I think they should, as part of their oversight responsibility. I wouldn't say it necessarily moves them closer or not to impeachment. I think what the Congress and what Speaker Pelosi are going to focus on is making sure the Congress fulfills its investigative and oversight responsibilities. And I think they're going to push to get that report, as they should.
All right, let's talk about you and your campaign. As we said, it's a crowded field, more than 20 people running for president, serious candidates. How does John Delaney stand out from all the others?
Well, I'm a problem solver by nature, and I think that's what we really need. Our next president needs to be a responsible president. And a responsible president would bring this country together, right? Remind us that this notion of common purpose is central to who we are, and actually start finding some common ground and solving problems and bring some new big ideas. And that, in many ways, makes me a more centrist and moderate candidate. I'm probably the most moderate candidate in this field.
Really?
Because, yeah, I think so, because I'm very focused on problem solving, right? I really want to get things done, because that's what I think this country needs. I think Congress and the legislative process and the president have largely been absent in getting things done that matter to the American people. And I want to bring back this notion that we can actually tackle these problems and we can kind of achieve the potential that we have as a people, but we have to work together to do it.
Well, speaking of moderation, you have said about some of your more liberal opponents, or I should say competitors, you've talked about Medicare for all, which some of them advocate as a, quote, half-baked socialist policy. You would support instead a public option, Medicare-like option for people under the age of 65. That wouldn't cover every American, though, would it?
Well, I do have a universal health care plan that actually does cover every American. A public option is something I would do right away. That's kind of a first 100-day agenda that I think I can get done to improve health care for the American people right away. But then I would push for my plan to create universal health care, where every American has health care as a right. I just don't believe the way to accomplish universal health care is with a government-only program. That's why I think the Medicare for All proposal is in fact bad policy, because it makes the government the only provider of health care. And we have ample evidence to suggest that if the government is the only payer in health care, it will never pay enough. Right now, Medicaid and Medicare don't cover costs. So if you take private insurance out of the equation, I think the quality of health care will go down.
So you would keep private insurance, but still find a way to cover everybody.
And you can do that, right? My proposal leaves Medicare alone. It creates a new government plan that everyone gets from when they're born to they're 65. We roll Medicaid into that. So that means everyone has health care from when they're born to the end of their life. But I also allow them to opt out, get a small tax credit, buy their own plan, or to do what Medicare beneficiaries do, which is to buy supplemental plans. That creates a mixed model of a government plan plus private insurance. It's a much healthier and stronger healthcare market, and it gives the American people what they fundamentally want, which is choices and options.
All right, let's talk very quickly. You spent a lot of time campaigning all over the country, early primary states. Your home state of Maryland, big city Baltimore, has a lot of problems, city problems, violence, tensions between the races, poverty. What would you do in the short run to help cities like Baltimore?
I think we have to invest in them at the end of the day. I think nothing happens unless someone invests. And I think in many of these communities, there's been chronic underinvestment in public education, in job creation, in transportation.
And where would the money come from?
Well, you've got to make it a priority, because I think if you don't make it a priority, you actually spend more money. I think the cost of doing nothing is not nothing. And we are seeing firsthand with the state of Maryland's failure to really invest in Baltimore the way they should have, that all citizens of Maryland are actually now paying a much higher price.
There's so many things I want to ask you. Your campaign, you resorted to some pretty unconventional means to try to spread out the number of people donating to your campaign. You at one point, I think 2 months ago, said you were going to give $2 of your own money for every charitable contribution to charity for anybody who contributed to your campaign. So how many more people did you pick up?
We got quite a bit. We got thousands and thousands of additional donors for it. It was really simple, Judy, because we have to get 65,000 donors to
In
be on
order
the debate
to
stage. You
participate
don't really
in the
have to.
debates.
I've qualified for the debates because of my performance in the polls, but this is another way
But
to
you
also...
still need to raise money from 65,000.
Well, it's an either or. You either qualify through the polls or you qualify with 65,000. But we want to get both. And I would rather actually give money to charity than to give money to digital marketing firms. Because that's kind of what you have to do to get that many donors.
Are you at 65,000?
We're not there yet, but we're making good progress.
We said you are the first Democratic candidate to announce. You announced back in July of 2017. I think nobody has been campaigning more than you have in the state of Iowa. There have been hundreds of campaign events, Iowa, New Hampshire, and other states. But you are still at 1%.
Well,
in the polls. Well, and let me just say, the others have gotten in the race. They're ahead of you. Why do you think you've struggled to get your identity out there?
Well, we're doing better in other polls. We just had a poll in New Hampshire that had us doing better. We had a poll in Iowa a couple weeks ago that had us at a higher rate. I think we're doing great on the ground. I think this race is wide open, right? We have 8 offices open in Iowa. We've got as big of a campaign team as anyone else. 4 county chairs of the 99 counties in Iowa have already endorsed me. None of the other candidates combined have any endorsements from any county chairs, right? I've been to all 99 counties in Iowa. I've campaigned everywhere. I think this race is wide open. They're not going to caucus in Iowa for 10 months. And I just think we're in a really good position on the ground there. And I think at the end of the day, my ideas are better. And the debates will, I think, start making that point.
On May the 8th, 2019, John Delaney, thank you very much.
So nice to be here. Thank you.
It's been 6 months since the most deadly and destructive fire in California history, the Camp Fire. Tonight's edition of PBS's Nova is a harrowing first-person account of that disaster and where it fits into a global trend toward more frequent massive infernos. The documentary Inside the Mega Fire comes from Miles O'Brien. And for us, he explores how researchers are breaking new ground in understanding the dangerous spread and intensity of the flames. It's part of our regular series on the leading edge of science.
This has got potential for a major incident.
When first responders arrived at the Camp Fire, an acre of forest every second. A horrific scenario was unfolding that also presented an opportunity for scientists to better understand how wildfires spread.
We're not gonna get through here. They're doing active suppression right there. But let's go up and see what we can find.
So meteorologist Craig Clements and his team from San Jose State University sped right toward the inferno. It was the morning of November 8th, 2018, and everyone who lived there had to leave in a hurry. They were forced to run a gauntlet through flames. There are only 4 roads that lead off the mountain, and all of them were perilous.
Oh my God, there's fires everywhere. I don't want to die here. I don't want to die.
Please get out of town, and as you're going out of town, please be careful.
With the frantic exodus still underway, we drove in the opposite direction. Eventually meeting up, they had found a relatively safe vantage point to gather some unprecedented data. We are driving in a one-of-a-kind custom rig. At the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, they're leveraging their expertise modeling weather and climate.
Fire is very challenging to predict because there are a lot of factors that are involved that are not really atmospheric or traditionally atmospheric.
Atmospheric scientist William Mahoney showed how the latest models can see trouble as it brews. In this case, close to home. The Cold Springs fire happened 16 miles west of Boulder in the little town of Nederland in July of 2016.
There was good data from this particular event in terms of how the fire progressed, the burn area boundary, and that made for really good verification data for our model so we can then use that to fine-tune the rate of spread and the heat content and flame length information.
The model is designed to allow them to predict the rate of the spread of the fire 18 hours in advance and run what-if scenarios for different moisture levels in the forest.
We're trying to simulate the general characteristics of a fire but we will definitely not be able to say at this second and in this location a tree is going to burn or a building is going to burn. You really almost need to know every tree, every bush, every piece of grass and what its state is to really predict what's going to happen.
Fire ecologist Jennifer Balch and her team from the University of Colorado are trying to find more precise, more efficient ways to assess forest health so that the models can be more accurate. She is focused on 8 30 by 30 meter plots, many of which were heavily damaged by the Cold Springs fire. Their work begins on the ground in the traditional way.
3.8.
Once the trees are precisely measured and characterized on terra firma, Balch and her team fly a drone 100 feet above each plot. The drone carries sensors that capture the same parts of the spectrum as those on board NASA satellites. By comparing these higher resolution drone scans with images from space, she hopes to find the dots and connect them. The Holy Grail, understanding how a forest is doing from space.
My hope is that we can actually get away from the intensive fieldwork and use drone-based observations, airborne and satellite-based observations to understand what's going on across thousands of trees.
To better understand the big picture, scientists who study wildfires need to explore them up close. On a good day, it's laborious. On a bad day, perilous.
If anything happens, we got to go, and our escape route is this way.
By the time it was over, the Camp Fire was the deadliest and most destructive in California history. 85 people died, nearly 19,000 structures destroyed. For scientists, the stakes justify the risk. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Miles O'Brien in Paradise, California.
Oh, that's something. There is much more in tonight's program than we could include here. Nova's Inside the Megafire airs on most PBS stations and streams online tonight at pbs.org/Nova. And that's the NewsHour for tonight. I'm Judy Woodruff. Join us online and again here tomorrow evening. For all of us at the PBS NewsHour, thank you, and we'll see you soon.
You're watching PBS.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by
Text night and day.
Catching that replay. Burning some fat.
Sharing the latest viral cat.
You can do the things you like to do with a wireless plan designed for you with talk, text, and data. Consumer Cellular. Learn more at consumercellular.tv.